Well, the NHS have been swept up in a scandal for giving so-called puberty blockers to children who identify as trans. There are growing concerns about the safety of this medication, so some people are surprised that the NHS have been dishing it out at double the demand, actually, since last year. Gender-critical feminist Dr Kathleen Stock wrote in The Telegraph today, NHS England has already announced that blockers should only be administered as part of a clinical trial. Why then, you might ask, are young patients not only still getting them, but getting them at higher rates than before? Part of the answer relates to the current chaos in youth gender services, which, despite the best efforts, are still heavily dependent on a discredited clinical model. And this is really the framing of this discussion now. Do certain pro-trans groups have too much influence when it comes to medical and political policy? Could it well be a normalisation of child abuse? What do you think? Are trans activists having too much influence over government policy? Let me know your thoughts. You can email me now, gbviews@gbnews.com. You can, of course, tweet us at gbnews. To debate this, I'm joined by journalist Josephine Bartosh and diversity and inclusion facilitator Katie John Wen. Both of you, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this. Joe, I'll start with you. Do you think that activist groups have got far too much influence when it comes to policy, both medical and political, and that actually could well be leading to a type of child abuse?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the whole creation of the idea of the transgender child is a nonsense. There isn't any medical basis to the idea that you can be born into the wrong body. There are some people who have gender dysphoria, and obviously sympathy for that condition is entirely valid, but that doesn't mean children can be born into the wrong body. If we were to still use language like transsexual, I think the idea of a transsexual child would rightly be very alarming to people. But essentially, by putting children on untested drugs, which a court have ruled were experimental, we are potentially sterilising and mutilating a generation of children, the majority of whom we know would otherwise grow up to be lesbian or gay. So yes, I do think it's fair to call this child abuse.
Katie, I'll ask the same question to you. I mean, do you feel as though this is in some way child abuse?
I wouldn't agree with the language, no. At a personal level, I do believe in caution around children and trans, because I do agree to some extent. Is there such a thing as a trans child? No, there's a child who's growing up who may develop gender dysphoria, who may develop an expression or identity in life that is outside the norm, outside the binary, outside typical expressions, and that should be kind of monitored and accommodated at a social level, not necessarily at a medical invasive level at all during someone's early years. I mean, I've always been cautious on kind of child and teen transition, but hindsight is a 5-letter word. And at the end of the day, when you're looking back in life, if you find that the only way to solve your gender dysphoria, having tried perhaps many other sources of help, including therapy, if the only source of help has been that one thing, transition, then typically you will have wanted to have had it earlier. But then, as I say, hindsight's a 5-letter word.
Look, Joe, what are the kind of stats on this stuff, though, or the general perception? You know, I mean, does it actually help kids? Or, I mean, I certainly am quite concerned that we're going to end up with a generation of children who have been deeply scarred in more ways than one as a result of trans activists getting a hold of government policy and healthcare policy.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen recently NHS trusts using software that was developed at a cost of £40 million, and it recorded the gender identity of babies, of newborn babies. Now, when journalists pushed back and asked the trust about that, the trust told them that it had been an error, but actually the press release made it very clear that it had taken a lot of research and consideration and time to come up with this. And the categories included things like cisgender. Now, that is an entirely ideological category, not a medical one. And it's really, really concerning when it comes to healthcare in particular, where it's vitally important to know what sex somebody is, that this sort of identity nonsense can get fed into policy.
OK, now, Katie, why are groups like Stonewall and other groups, they're not the only one at all, by the way, so keen on pushing all of this stuff? So keen, do you think, on getting into the minds of young children and pushing stuff that can change them for life? I mean, do you not think that's maybe quite dangerous, really?
Well, if I can segue just off the end of the previous question that Joe responded to as well, because I was speaking to NHS staff just this week and they were asking me questions and I responded to exactly that kind of question around, do you record sex or gender? I say, well, for a child, you record sex, and as someone grows, you may record gender identity or transition as an additional component, but you should always record sex as well. I know people both going from male to female, female to male, who have actually gone back to the NHS and say, can I have my sex marker changed back to my birth sex so that I get proper NHS care? Because I, as someone who started life as male, identifies to somebody as a trans person now, I don't use the female language, but ultimately I can still get prostate cancer, a little bit less likely because I've taken estrogen, but someone who was born female can still get female health conditions. And so as a result, the NHS does need to monitor sex. And so, I mean, I'm completely in support of that. So sometimes there's a lot of what I would call misguided allyship. And then when you talk about organizations like Stonewall, and I was kind of involved in some of the engagement, not as a trans person, but with Ruth Hunt when they went LGBT. So I was aware of what was going on at that point and the discussions. And these things were done out of a good heart, you might say, rather than kind of a conspiracy theory. And that is true also of NHS staff. They generally speaking are trying to put patient care and individuals first, trying to humanize people, but sometimes overt allyship makes a mistake.
Now, Joe, I saw you raising your eyebrows at something there. What was that?
Well, I know that Stonewall got a large donation from the Arcus Foundation for explicitly extending what they did to include the T, to add the T to the LGB. So it wasn't an entirely, I don't think it was an entirely...
Well, that's interesting. No, that's interesting. Let me delve into that a little bit, because there's always the question asked to a lot of people, who funds you? Who funds you? That's a very typical question when you're in politics, when you're in current affairs, and you're in media. Do you think that it's worthwhile asking that question about some groups like Stonewall? Because if that does influence the kind of stuff that they put out there, and that stuff then influenced government policy, and it is combined with a lot of fear, the heavy dose of language like you're a transphobe, etc., to really double down on that, is that something that people should look into, Joe?
Absolutely. I think there's been a shocking lack of transparency. So essentially when Ruth Hunt took over, same-sex marriage had been achieved, and there wasn't that much to do. So that's why it was expanded to include, in my opinion, that's why it was included to include the T. And now, to me, it seems obvious that there was antagonism between the LGB and the T, because one is based on identity, on who you feel you are, and the other is based on who you are attracted to on a biological level. So, there's a tension there to start with. Now, when it comes to funding, there's a group called ILGA. Now, they produced a report with a global law firm, which advised trans groups to lobby their governments to get ahead of the law when it came to gender self-identification. So that's why Stonewall were accused of representing the law as they wanted it to be rather than it is. So we've ended up with a de facto system of gender self-identification spread across the 850 organisations that were once paid members of Stonewall.
Okay. All right. Now, obviously, Stonewall are not here to defend themselves, and we can't, make any further allegations really about them. There's no doubt there's a few bits and bobs there that they would dispute. Katie, I'll just final one to you, if that's all right, Katie, which is, do you think that as a society we always had thousands, millions of children in every single generation who were walking around feeling as though they'd been born into the... Oh, we'll never find out because Katie's just gone. Well, there we go. That brings that to it. I was going to ask whether or not we thought that we'd always had millions of children walking around feeling as though they'd been born into the wrong body and really struggling with that, or whether this is something that maybe has been planted into some people's minds through the education system, etc. Katie's back. Good stuff. Katie, so I'll just throw it back to you. So look, basically, do you think that we've always had millions of kids walking around feeling as though they've been born into the wrong body, or are we seeing an increase in that now because it's actually being planted in their minds?
I don't think it's overtly being planted in their minds. I don't think we have always had this number of kids, as you put it. I do think that we should, in the same way that we should perhaps ask questions about funding, whether that's funding of media, funding of organisations, or anything. I do think asking questions is always right. Asking questions of the individual who say they are trans. Yes, you should ask the questions. Okay. Where did this come from? How long have you felt this? Why do you feel this? And I do think there has been a kind of an increase. Part of the increase is down to kind of, I wouldn't call it advertising, but the very fact that you can find out about it now. And it's less rare because it is known about. But I think there are many reasons why people are trans. And I think there are people for whom being trans is the wrong thing. And that's why we have detransitions. And I think it is fair to ask all of those questions. We've got to create an environment in which it is okay to ask those questions without being accused of being a transphobe for asking them. And in order to be able to actually put the child or the young adult's best interests at heart. And for that, we have a paucity of mental health services. So that's the area of service that should be being boosted in addition to kids.
Yeah, I think people have a right to be very concerned about if, like, Stonewall gets involved in other groups. Again, I want to emphasise, just using Stonewall here because they're kind of the most famous one, right? But other groups as well, they get involved with government policy, they get involved with businesses, they get involved in every single aspect, it seems, of a lot of life. And there does appear to be a lot of fear about any pushback to that. And when they have real influence and when real children are involved with it, I raise some serious questions about that. But both of you, look, thank you very, very much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Informative stuff on both sides. As journalist Joe Bartosh there and diversity and inclusion facilitator Katie John Wayne. Get your views coming in, gbviews@gbnews.com. I'll go to the inbox shortly. But